Welcome to Lesson 4.2, all about voting in America. In today's lesson, you're going to need to know about voter turnout, voter registration, and milestones in the expansion of voting that are listed there. So for today's lesson, we'll start with the history of voting in America and talk about those milestones, then a little bit about turnout and why it is the way it is, and then finally we'll end with what you need in order to register to vote and how to vote. So at the founding of America in the 1780s, voting as a form of political participation was largely limited to white male landowners, and that gradually by the 1820s and 1830s became universal white male suffrage. But before the Civil War, almost no women and no non-white males could vote in the United States. Now, after the Civil War, during what was known as the Reconstruction era, there were several amendments and laws passed in order to aid newly freed slaves and help them join the body politic. One of these was very significant, known as the 15th Amendment, and it banned voting discrimination based on race. Almost immediately afterwards, when Reconstruction ended, many states, particularly in the South, adopted race-related discrimination laws to undermine that amendment. So things like literacy tests and poll taxes, which were fees that had to be paid in order to vote, were passed by many states, and these were directed at people, usually African Americans, but sometimes poor whites as well. Now, the women's suffrage movement is another significant milestone in the history of voting in America, and it really began in the 1840s and 1850s with small numbers of women pushing for the right to vote. But by the 1890s and 1900s and 1910s, this had become a significant large number of people, of middle class and upper class, mostly white women, pushing for the right to vote. Some of them were imprisoned and jailed for protesting. They went on hunger strikes. They were even tortured and force-fed while they were in jail. So there were significant issues related to that. The U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment and it was ratified by the states in 1920 that banned voter discrimination based on sex. We'll fast forward a little bit here to the civil rights movement in Vietnam in the 1960s. The 24th Amendment was an amendment to the Constitution that banned the use of poll taxes, which I mentioned earlier. And much of the efforts of the civil rights movement was focused on eliminating those discriminatory laws that were passed after the end of Reconstruction. So the Voting Rights Act was a federal law passed in 1965 that banned the use of literacy tests and any law that would result in discrimination based on race or language. And many places were actually required, up until very recently, to pre-clear these laws with the Justice Department to ensure that they didn't result in discrimination. The 26th Amendment, passed a few years later in the wake of Vietnam, banned voting discrimination based on age over 18. And this is, again, a serious issue. There were people that were murdered as part of this effort in order to register people to vote and get people to vote throughout the American South. And there's a photo there of three Mississippi civil rights workers who were murdered, beaten, shot, and buried alive in 1964. Now, despite the efforts and the significant hardships that were gone through on the part of past generations, many Americans today don't vote. Compared to other industrial countries around the world, actually, the United States has very, very low turnout. Presidential elections tend to have the highest level of turnout, so you should know generally what the levels of turnout are. About 50 to 60% of eligible voters nationally turn out for presidential elections. That's it, only about half. And that's the best we can do. The second level is kind of known as midterms. These are the off-year congressional elections. So between presidential election years, when the U.S. House is up for election, and the U.S. Senate, 1/3 of them are up for election every 2 years. Only about 35 to 45% of eligible voters show up. And in local elections where you have mayors and city councils and school boards, the things that actually affect people's day-to-day lives, usually only about 10 to 20% of people show up. But that can vary tremendously based on the community, the issues on the ballot, things like that. So there are several reasons that explain why we have such low turnout in the United States. And there's a chart there that actually says, that's a poll of the 2014 midterm elections and says, why didn't you vote? And about half the reasons that people gave had to do with the structure of how we vote, the registration system. You know, oh, I forgot to register, I didn't have my ID, the polling hours were not conducive to when I was available, blah, blah, blah. But there are some other reasons. You know, the one on the bottom right, didn't like the candidates, didn't know enough. That can deal with competitiveness of the elections and the type of elections. The more competitive an election is, the likelier it is to have higher turnout. So when we have things like gerrymandering that eliminates competitiveness, people don't show up and vote if they don't think their vote matters. People show up and vote for things that they've heard of, like the presidential elections, but they may not have heard of local elections. And generally there are some demographic indicators there listed for you that tell you that older people tend to vote, wealthier people tend to vote, more educated people tend to vote more than people who are less educated. So as education rises, people tend to vote more. So there are demographic pictures of people who will vote. So now that we've talked about, voter levels and the history of voting a little bit, let's get down to the business of what do you need in order to vote. In order to register in the state of Missouri, you have to prove your identity, and you have to be age 17 and a half or older, as long as you're 18 by the election day, and prove that you've been a resident of Missouri for 30 days. You have to be a U.S. citizen, and that's true in every state in the Union. You cannot be on parole or probation due to a felony conviction, and you cannot be currently serving a jail sentence. You also can never have been convicted of a felony related to voting. Now, if you were convicted of armed robbery, but you served your time, you're not on parole or probation, and you're in Missouri, you're allowed to vote. In other states, if we learned in class, that's not necessarily always true. So these just depend on a lot on where you live. In order to participate, in order what you need to vote, you got to be in line between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. As long as you're in line, you can vote. Even if it's at 9 o'clock at night, just stay in line. You also need proof of identity. It does not have to be photo ID, and there's an example of several of them listed for you. So here's your overview, those objectives. Hopefully you've taken good notes. We'll see you next time.